rather look at me.
Camera roll 20, sound 20.
Why don't you start, Jenny, by telling me what Lancaster was like. Lancaster, rather, when you were a kid. What changes? What was it like then, and how does it change?
The most I remember when I was a child, I only knew what happened around our own home because I never got farther than a few miles from home at that time. And you traveled by horse and buggy or carriage, or else you rode a horse. And then my father was one of the first people around there to get a car. He got a car first. It was an old truck. Well, it wasn't old, but I mean it would be old now. It had these big wheels with solid tires. And on a Sunday we put benches in and sat on and went to church that way. And weekdays he took out the benches and loaded it up for market. He attended market in Reading and took the produce to market, which he grew. I didn't do much work on the farm. I worked in the house. When we wanted to do shopping, then we had to go to the city, of course. But that was a day's trip. You took one day to drive to the city and do your shopping, and you didn't go very often, once a year on a shopping trip. And for groceries, my father would get the things at a wholesale place. He'd get one case of shredded wheat, one case of cornflakes, and one case of grape nuts. Then we alternated.
Well, do you think, is the world a smaller place than it was when you were a boy?
Oh, yes. Any state news or country news, you waited days to get it. You didn't, sometimes you waited a week before you knew a war was over.
Sometimes that was good. If we had a challenge then, and we accepted it, and we took it, and we enjoyed ourselves in it, and that's what I like, if you have a challenge. If you have it too easy, that's what's happening to our nation now. We have things just given to us. If we feel we don't want to work, well, the government will take care of us. Those days we didn't. Now, we had stresses in the early days, I admit that. If you had some hostile Indians, it wasn't very comfortable, but we met the challenge, and same as the Pilgrims did when they came over. They didn't have anything to eat, but they did the best they could. They didn't have any Social Security. They didn't have any do-gooders to take care of them. What about Abraham Lincoln? If they'd have had a do-gooder to take care of him, we'd have never heard of him.
Well, what about today?
Well, I was thinking of, if you got sick and you needed a doctor, well, in those days you had to take your horse and your buggy and go after the doctor. Now you just call him on the telephone or get, run to the hospital.
He doesn't come. They just sent an ambulance from the hospital. Charge you plenty,
What has that change done for us? The fact that most of us are now not on the farm, and most of us are now not in the factory.
Well, see, before my time yet, the farm was self-sufficient. They raised everything. They spun their own clothes. Now, in my generation, we were pretty near self-sufficient, but we didn't spin our own clothes anymore. But we had our chickens. We had our pigs. We had killed the beef every year, and
had a cow for milk.
Yeah, a cow for milk, make cheese, all different kind of cheeses, and you were almost self-sufficient, but not quite. We didn't spin our clothes, although in those days the feed company sent their feed in Florida-colored bags, so my wife would make dresses for the girls.
All our 3 girls went through school in what we call feed bags.
But they were beautiful Florida feed bags, but she was skilled at sewing, so she could do that,
Well, would it be easy to go back, or are there some things about this whole thing we're living in now that are really better? Is it?
Yes, I wouldn't just know more than I'd want to give up my electric stove to go back to a cook stove. The way I had in the kitchen for many years, cooked with a cook stove, made my meals with wood and coal. And now I have the electric stove. I wouldn't think of going back. So naturally things are better today than they were in those days. But for that time, we had a good life.
But it was fun. The challenge was great. But the challenge is great today, too. Let your soul catch up with your body, every now and then.
But I was going to say it depends on your own opinion about it. If you let it concern you, that you worry, then it's better you wouldn't have it. But if you want it just as a matter of information.
The whole thing is life. In life, it's just how you consider things, your mental attitude toward it. If you take it as a challenge, it's a wonderful thing. just like going to market, like Bob does now, and like I did for many years. Get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, go down 50 miles and load. Well, that's a dog's life to some people. To me, it was a challenge, and I enjoyed it.
When you were out there working on the farm, what kind of a feeling does that give you, working?
Well, I tell you, I like to get my hands into the dirt, you know, and as I told you, I did office work for many years, and it was like a concentration camp to me. And I had no money to go out and buy a farm, and so her father was getting old, and he quit farming, and all her brothers quit too, and so finally he left me start. But he didn't think a city slicker like me could make a success of it. He was rather reluctant, but my mother-in-law, she stuck with me. And then after I started, things went all right, so he did too then. So I had the best mother-in-law that a person could ever have. I really did. She really helped me out, and we had a lot of experiences, you know. I remember he used to have an old mule, and he had an IQ of pretty high, I think, because as soon as my wife rang the dinner bell, he'd stop cultivating anything he was doing for me, and he'd want to go into the barn to get his coffee break, you know. So I had to quit.
You know, when you hear stories like that, like the one you just said, that's so different than my life. To say that the change isn't enormous.
Well, you're another generation, see, and we look back to what we thought were the good old days, but yet we wouldn't want to go back to them. We like these too. So we're thankful and glad we could.
So he got to farm because I lived on a farm, but I didn't want to live on a farm. I went to school, and I was a school teacher.
She taught, after she quit high school, she taught school.
Before I was nothing. But I didn't like to go out and get all dirty, and one thing I hated was milking cows. I had to get up before I went to school and milk 1 or 2 cows every morning. And one time, one kicked real bad, and it scared me that I said I didn't want to milk. So when he talked about a farm, I said, well, you've got to promise me that I don't have to milk. So that was the only stipulation. Okay, he promised, and he always kept his promise. I never needed to milk. But I liked to work in the garden. I learned to like that. I didn't, as a girl, I didn't work out. My mother needed me in the house. With 6 brothers, they could do the outside work. I worked in the house. But then, when we were married, I started growing flowers, and I found I enjoyed it. It was therapeutic
And she
value
started to make these cookies too, and she's known all over the countryside for her famous decorated cookies.